Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar, part one of the Road to the Budget Bill, the impact of pending legislation on public school districts, presented by Roetzel and Andress LLP and Roetzel Consulting Solutions. My name is Susan Keating Anderson, and I am a shareholder of Roetzel and Andress and the practice group manager of our education law group. Joining me today is my partner, Lisa Burleson, who is a shareholder and a member of our education law group, and Sherri Warner of counsel to Roetzel and Andress and a director of Roetzel Consulting Solutions. Also joining us later in the program for a panel discussion are Kent Zeman, CFO and treasurer of the Lakewood City School District, Brian Kuhn, superintendent of Clark-Shawnee Local School District, and Dr. Eugene T.W. Sanders, Executive Director of the Ohio Mid-Sized School Districts Leadership Collaborative, Inc. After the panel discussion, we will save some time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit those during the program, and we will address those at the end of the program. So we're going to start this morning by talking about the current version of House Bill 33, the budget bill for fiscal years 2024 and 2025, which is just hot off the presses, having passed the House yesterday by a vote of 77 to 19. Because she lives and breathes this stuff more than anyone I've ever known, Sherri Warner will lead the discussion on the status of the various education-related provisions of the House bill. It is important to note that this bill is still very much in flux, having just passed the House and now heading to the Senate for that legislative process. So certainly the provisions that we're going to talk about here today are subject to change between now and the end of June, when hopefully we'll see a final approved bill. So any opinions expressed here today regarding either the prior history of the provisions or the path or expected changes to those provisions are just our opinions, and since we have no crystal ball to tell us for certain what the final bill will look like. Finally, I would be remiss if I forgot to remind you all that this is part one of a three-part series. So please keep an eye out in your email for part two, which will be coming towards the end of May, early June, depending on the timing of legislative action at the Senate level. And then our final part three of the series webinar will be late June, early July, again, depending on the timing of the final passage of the bill. So please mark your calendars for that time frame, and again, keep your eye out in your email for the specific dates. So with all that said, I'm going to hand this over to Sherri Warner to get us started on the discussion. Sherri, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning. Before I dive into provisions in the bill, I want to give you a little bit of a concept of the kind of numbers that we're talking about. So currently, the version, when I say numbers, or I'm giving you figures, unless I specifically say the governor's proposal, these are all the provisions and allocations as passed by the House. So the House has allocated about $28 billion for FY24 and about $29.7 billion in state funds for FY25. Of those allocations, about 20, let me see here, I've got to see through my notes, sorry. 567 million were allocated to, I'm sorry, that's not correct. 29 billion of that money is going to education. So the governor created, or the governor was on board 2 years ago when we did the Cupp-Patterson bill, or the Fair Funding Plan. And when that occurred, the General Assembly at the time was concerned about the costs. And so they chose to phase that plan in. And the plan was set as their proposed phase-in. The governor continued that phase-in, but one of the things that's important to remember with the governor's proposal is that the governor proposed keeping all of the cost allocations at 2018 costs. One of the things that the House did was increase those cost inputs to 2022 costs. So it's going to raise the base cost for a typical pupil on average to about $8,231 a year for a traditional school and about $9,726 a year for a career technical school. With that increased close to $1 billion over the biennium for state funds to increase the cost of this, the base rate 2022 cost allocations. Now, that all of that money didn't come into education. What you saw the House do was move money between line items. And so one of the things that they did, and we'll talk about it a little later, is they took the money from the school resource officers and dumped it back into funds that they use in the base cost formula to find some of the dollars to increase these cost inputs. So if you start getting confused saying, I thought this was being funded at this level and it's now at this level, it's because they had to move the money around in order to be able to fund the formula at the 2022 cost inputs. They did that because a lot of advocates were telling them that those cost inputs were the most important thing that we could raise during this process. We needed to keep the formula current so that every year we weren't trying to battle getting the base costs up moving forward as we continue to phase this in. So the traditional funding formula will be phased in at the 2024 statewide average base cost per pupil using 2022 data. The career technical will be done in the same way, and so will the base costs increase for our community schools and STEM schools. Next slide, please. Which is more information. And this document, we will send the link in the follow-up email to where you can find this document. This document is the comparison document. As you can see at the top, it has the executive proposal and then as reported by House Finance. This document can be found on the Legislative Service Commission's website, and it can be very informative for you. So we will send the link in the follow-up email. Next slide, please. This is the explanation of the joint vocational school formula. And as you can see, they're using the 2022 cost inputs. And at the bottom, you can see what the fiscal impact is over the governor's recommended appropriation. Next slide, please. Gifted funding. So during the last budget, oftentimes in education policy, what you see happen is they will make changes in temp law in a budget to see how things kind of work and pan out. And then what they'll do in a subsequent budget is make these reporting requirements or these changes permanent. And that's what's happened in the gifted funding space. During the last budget, the General Assembly inserted law that regarding enhanced reporting and some auditing changes of what districts can do with their gifted services and their gifted funding. The House is proposing that these requirements be made permanent and that ODE change the grade bands for these reports from the current K3, 4.8, 9.12 to a K2 model. You will report 3, 6 together, grade 7, 8 together, and then 9, 12 together. So with those changes, we will make those reporting requirements permanent. So you will be having to collect that data, and then you will be reporting in different grade bands such that they can get a deeper dive on what's going on with each, a deeper dive into what's going on in each grade area. Sorry about that. Next slide, please. Again, this is another provision that we saw come into play in the last General Assembly. They put in a dropout prevention and recovery e-school pilot project, and they provided alternative funding for these programs. This pilot project is now being made permanent, and it is going to open up this alternative funding model to any dropout recovery school that chooses to participate in the program. Next slide, please. And then the final one in the kind of the general funding space we're going to talk about today is the Ed Choice Scholarship Program. Now, school choice is a hot button topic in Columbus and is something that has had legislation outside of the budget in both the House and the Senate. I'm sure many of you are aware that we have the backpack bill in the House, which would create educational savings accounts and money would be placed in the account for each child. In the Senate, there's a bill which would expand the Ed Choice Scholarship Program. The governor came in his proposal and said, I would like to increase the scholarship program. Currently, kids can get, or individuals can get scholarships, families can get scholarships. If the family income does not exceed 250% of the federal poverty level, the governor proposed increasing that to 400%. When the House got done with their version of the budget, they had increased that to a 450% of the federal poverty level. So more children will be eligible for those first-time Ed Choice vouchers. Because the House proposed increase in the cost inputs for the traditional funding formula, that's also going to increase the funding needed for these Ed Choice scholarships because they're based off of the traditional funding line item as well. So the cost increase for these increase in scholarships will be about 780 to 850 million a year. I will tell you, this is going to be a space I think we will probably see a great deal of conversation and additional changes in the Senate. Yesterday in interviews, the Senate president did state that he would like to see greater increases in this level. So we may see a no cap and anybody could be eligible for an Ed Choice scholarship or a cap as high as 500 or 600% of the federal poverty level. Right now at 450%, that's going to be a family of four making about $132,000 a year would be eligible for these Ed Choice scholarships. Another point I do want to make, in the last budget cycle, there was a change prior to the last budget. Money for these individuals went to the district, and then the district paid the scholarship to the entity that the child was attending. So it was what was called a deduct model. What the state did this time in the last budget, after having had a lot of concern expressed by school districts, which makes sense because some districts weren't getting the amount of money for the child and the scholarship that they were having to pay out. They made the decision to fund these directly out of the foundation funding line item rather than running them through the school districts. That is continuing under this budget, and we expect it to continue. I don't see that changing, but I did want to make that point on the Ed Choice scholarship. Next slide. So the first one we're going to deep dive into is the disadvantaged pupil impact aid spending requirements. This is an add-on. I'm sure all of you are aware that districts receive on top of the base cost for addressing the learning challenges for children living in poverty. The governor added and the House agreed to modifications and how these services can be used. And just so we're clear, one of the requirements he put in place, I think it's not something that we are discussing today, but there's been a lot of conversation around the fact that the governor is wanting to require all reading curriculums be based on the science of reading. And so he had proposed money in the budget to pay for new curriculums for all districts. There is language in the budget which requires ODE to come up with model curricula, and then districts will have to use those curriculums, and then to also money to train teachers in this new science of reading method of teaching literacy. The governor does require under DPAA funds that any money being used to assist with reading interventions must be aligned with the Science of Reading Initiative. It's also going to require districts that provide access to community-based health and behavioral health services. It's going to require that districts provide access to community-based health and behavioral health services. And then the final major change is it's going to require that curricula include trauma-informed services, but not any social or emotional learning. And that may be a big change for some of our districts that have been engaged in the social or emotional learning space. So with that, I believe, Susan, you're going to talk about some of the impacts of this potential provision.
Right, and before I get into DPIA, I did just want to make a comment regarding the school voucher. I heard earlier in the week some reporting on the city of Cleveland is considering may have approved a forgiveness program for medical bills for city residents. And the reporting on that made a comment that, and they're using the threshold of 400% of the poverty level as well for eligibility. And the reporter commented that at that level, 80% of the city of Cleveland residents would be eligible for the forgiveness under that program. And I just thought, wow, you know, because if that's the threshold for the voucher program, you know, 80% of the city of Cleveland residents, you know, what an impact that could have on, you know, enrollment in the school district. That just was really very striking to me. So, you know, in terms of the DPIA, and Sherri's going to talk next about the student wellness funds, and I think this applies to both, really. I mean, I think that, you know, this is really going to hit both, you know, action items that you'll see needed by both your treasurer, by your superintendent, central office, and Board of Ed in terms of reviewing your existing curriculum to make sure, for instance, that it is hitting the alignments with the science of reading and evidence-based strategies and making adjustments there. Certainly looking at your PD, your current PD programming to make sure it's in compliance with what these requirements may be. Some collective bargaining agreements address PD in a very specific way. Others don't, but if there's, you know, for instance, if you have a collective bargaining agreement that has your union weighing in on PD, that might be impacted, you know, by these changes and that sort of thing. And then certainly you're going to have to be reviewing any existing contracts that you have with service providers of behavioral health and wellness programming to make sure that you're complying with that as well. And I'll toss it back to you, Sherri.
Okay. So the next one is the Student Wellness and Success Funds. Again, these funds really came into play when the governor, we started with these wraparound services. The bill is going to place restrictions and requirements on the way districts can use these dollars. Districts will have to use 50% of their funds on physical and mental health initiatives. They will be required to develop and post, they will be required to post plans that are developed in coordination with community health, mental health providers, along with their local alcohol, drug addiction, and mental health boards. They're also—
Sherri, if I could just interrupt you, I think we need to advance to the next slide on the student wellness.
Sorry, I thought you did.
Yep, no, there it is.
And this may actually have 2 slides with it.
It does.
Yes. So as I was saying, you're going to have to develop a plan. You're going to have it at a board meeting. That plan is going to have to be developed in coordination with community health, mental health partners, or your local alcohol, drug addiction, and mental health boards. They're also going to be putting in place guidelines, or deadlines by which, I should say, deadlines by which you have to use these funds. And finally, ODE is going to be able to develop correction action plans and or withhold funds from districts that they determine are not spending these funds appropriately. You may want to advance to the next slide. Susan, do you want to comment?
Sure. Well, again, as I mentioned already, I mean, you know, between the DPIA and the Student Wellness Fund provisions, you know, I think number one, what it looks like is going to result in is, you know, a more restrictive structure for schools in terms of how they can utilize these dollars, as well as, you know, some stringent reporting requirements that are going to have to be put into place, and penalties through ODE that would include, you know, having to give back the funding if it's not spent on the schedule that's required. The Board of Ed is going to be involved because the plan has to, you know, go before the board, and there has to be public notice and then posting on it. So there's going to be, you know, I think many steps required to get all this up and running, and, you know, to ensure compliance with the provisions.
Next slide, please. So we're going to leave funding at this point in time and move to a dedicated fund, the sports gaming revenue. And when sports gaming came into the state, they, like with the lottery commission profits, decided to try to funnel some of that towards education, and it was to be funneled towards supporting K-12 athletics and extracurricular activities. And as I said to you at the start of the webinar, the House did increase the foundation formula line item significantly, but that increase is not solely done by just putting more money into education. They did some rearranging, and this is one of those line items where they took some funds from. And they did that by increasing the amount of sports gaming tax revenue available to schools by limiting the amount that is going to be dedicated to K-12 athletics and extracurricular activities to $15 million. So this will then allow them to take additional money and fund other support mechanisms within the budget bill, including the formula aid payments. Lisa, do you have comments on that?
Just maybe one or two. So the interesting part here in the reallocation by the House is that the governor did not have a specific proposal in the executive budget for any reallocation of the sports gaming tax revenue, but the governor did propose to increase the sports gaming receipts tax rate from 10% to 20%. The projection, of course, in the fiscal effect of that is increased sports gaming tax receipts by $120 million to $175 million per year. So the fact that the House is proposing to relax the requirement of a specific earmark of those dollar funds being used for sports gaming profits education fund solely directed at athletics and other extracurricular activities to more of a general funding mechanism, schools are still going to receive the education fund payments to use for K-12 athletics and extracurriculars under the sports gaming profits education fund. But now, theoretically, under the House proposal, they're going to receive more funds from the more funds in the general fund as a result of the proposed changes.
Next slide, please. So replacement property tax levies. Currently, when you go to raise or put a levy on the ballot, you have the ability to choose whether you have a new levy, whether it's an emergency levy, a renewal levy, or a replacement levy. This provision in the House would eliminate your authority to use replacement levies after January 1st of 2025. The impact of that will be the fact that you will not be able to increase you will have the same millage, but the new, the growth in the millage that would have occurred with the reallocation or the increase in property values will not be attached to that levy. So you'll only be able to raise what was certified at the time of the initial levy being passed. And I won't be surprised to see this provision have a lot of debate. There's been a lot of concern expressed, but there are definitely a group of members who believe that any increase in dollars for schools, local governments at all, they need to come with a new levy and should not be able to quote unquote hide that increase in replacement language. Lisa?
Yeah, just quickly, it was interesting to note the governor did not have a proposal on this particular line item in his version of the budget, and yet the House introduced a proposal to completely eliminate the ability for all local government entities, including school districts, to levy replacement property taxes beginning with elections held on or after January 1 of 25. So when we read the House version of the budget, it's just a straight elimination. There's no exceptions, there's no explanation, there's no what if you have one existing, what do you do? They're just, I agree with you, Sherri, there's going to have to be a lot of additional commentary and debate on this particular proposal as this heads to the Senate, I think, which happens yet this week. Is that right, Sherri? It's headed to the Senate. Only by virtue of the fact that there are several school districts, some of which I work with, that have current replacement property tax levies that they're working from. So this will be a really important provision of this version of the budget bill for us to keep an eye on.
And one other comment on that, it would be, I think your replacement levies currently would stay, but you would not, the question will become, when you go to renew those, will they be at the replacement rate or will they be at the original levy rate had you not done the replacement to begin with? So that's going to be a very interesting dynamic to watch as we move forward. Next slide, please.
And Sherri, if I can just add, I mean, just as, you know, someone who supports school districts and, you know, their levy activities and looking at their levy options, it's troubling to see, you know, one of the options currently available to them potentially being eliminated in the culture that we have right now, where it's very difficult. It's going to be very challenging for a school district to pass a levy to begin with. And so to eliminate one option for a school district, you know, will certainly present, you know, even more challenges when a board is looking to put something on the ballot.
So this next provision is interesting. I find it interesting that it was in the budget, although I think if you saw the way it was passed yesterday in a very bipartisan manner, that will offer some explanation. One of the major concerns with the fair funding formula was the fact that there was no, by the formula being based on cost inputs of actual costs to districts, there was no incentive or downward pressure to keep costs under control. And one of the biggest costs they were concerned about were teacher salaries. The bill as written or passed by the House will increase the minimum base salary for teachers that we find in the revised code from $30,000 a year to $40,000 a year. And then it increases all of the statutory steps that are in the code based on that new number. So I think this will have significant impacts for those districts. Now, there aren't, you know, there's only about 16,800 teachers currently below the proposed minimums. So, you know, they're saying it's not going to have a significant impact. I still think that's probably close to 20% of our teaching population in the state is going to be impacted by this. And I'm sure there's going to be significant collective bargaining issues along with this provision, which I believe Susan's going to discuss now.
Right. Well, I agree. I mean, I think this is one of the, you know, provisions of the many provisions that's really going to have a significant impact on school districts and quite the ripple effect. Now, Sherri, I do want to just confirm something. There is no talk of providing any dollars to school districts, right, to cover the increased personnel costs that will come with this?
Correct. What will happen is in 2 years, if we can get the new cost inputs increased to where they should be, which, you know, this year it's 2022, so in 2 years it should be 2024, that would then account for, so it's going to be a look back, but that would account for the increases that they would see. But there is no new dollars attached to this particular provision.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, Sherri, I mean, you know, in terms of the fiscal effect, it was noted that about 16,800 teachers are currently below the proposed minimum, and so that total, though, of the related to those teachers, that's a total of $79.5 million annually. So I think a big question here is, when will this be effective? And will there be any language built in to this provision that would, for instance, make it effective after an existing, you know, collective bargaining agreement that is in place when this passes? Or are districts going to be required to reopen all of their CBAs when this becomes in effect and immediately, you know, negotiate the impact of this increase, which, you know, so I mean, we're not only talking about the direct financial impact of having to move all these teachers that are below the threshold to higher salaries, but then this is going to impact the step schedules as well. And so then as you move up the salary schedule under the existing step schedules, all of those teachers at higher levels, you know, will potentially be seeing increases as well. And, you know, in terms of that, I mean, if the district is facing significant financial increases from this, then it may be that they're going to have to be looking for concessions from their unions in other financial areas in order to be able to afford these increases. And so, you know, then you could be talking about potentially seeking an increase in employee health insurance premium contributions, which is always a tricky thing anyways to address. Perhaps, you know, putting in a spousal carve out if you don't already have that, collective bargaining agreements more and more because of the recruiting and retention issues that school districts are facing, you know, not only in the state, but, you know, really nationwide. More and more what you're seeing in CBAs are provisions that say that teachers that come in from other districts with experience will be credited at a certain point on their salary schedule. So that would impact that credit as well, and that may need to be looked at. So this will certainly have a very far-reaching impact, not only just from the financial standpoint, but just even from an operational standpoint. And again, I think what's going to be key is, when does this go into effect? If there's an existing collective bargaining agreement, will there be language built in similar to what there was, you know, years ago now under the OTES program that said, you know, this will become in effect, you know, when the current collective bargaining agreement expires? Or is this something that's going to require reopening and addressing through an MOU right away? Yeah. So this is definitely one I think that districts need to watch very carefully.
I think there was some minimalization of what this provision was actually going to do. I think everybody just thought, well, we're just going to give a base bump to everybody below and everything else is going to stay the same. And I think you're all aware that's not the way this is going to work. And I would add not only healthcare costs, but also the increase in costs due to the employer contributions to STRS will be another impact on districts that I don't know that people are taking into account. I will let you know that the last time this increase occurred, or the last time we changed the base minimum salary for teachers was 2003. So it's been something that people have been trying to do for several years, and obviously they got it done this year. Pretty significant impact, and we'll see how this plays out in the Senate. Next slide, please. So school resource officers, the governor in his State of the State address announced that he intended to allow every school in the state of Ohio to have a school resource officer in the building, and the state was going to pay for that. It was going to cost about $194 million each year. And while that proposal was certainly heralded by many districts and many individuals, there were some that felt that they wanted that money to be used in other ways or to allow for additional flexibility. The House did remove this provision, and they rolled the money into, this is one of those provisions where I said they kind of found money and moved money between line items. They zeroed this line item out and moved it up to, I think, wellness dollars, or potentially DPIA dollars. They just dumped it kind of into the foundation funding formula. So this provision currently is not in the budget, but I do think, given the importance the governor placed on it, and with the belief that school resource officers can assist with school safety, given the shootings and other violent events we've seen at schools recently, this will be something that will be hotly debated, if not in the Senate, at least during conference committee. Susan?
Right. So depending on how this, you know, ends up coming out in the final bill, I mean, this could certainly lead to schools that don't currently have a school resource officer looking to add one. If there are dollars that they can allocate, you know, that they will receive and can allocate to that, schools may be looking, even if you have existing SROs, they may be looking to increase those staffing levels. And, you know, I think that this will certainly foster more debate on the benefits and perhaps, you know, challenges to having SROs in school buildings. I think there are differing opinions on that depending on the community that you live in. So, I think this is something that also needs to be watched pretty carefully.
Next slide. So we're going to kind of switch over to teacher professional changes in our teacher space. There are several that are proposed. The first one is this pre-service teacher permit. The governor is proposing that ODE establish a pre-service teacher permit for students who are enrolled in educator preparation programs. And it then requires all students who are enrolled in these programs to obtain one of these permits prior to teaching, participating in training exercises, or serving as a substitute teacher. Individuals with these permits are subject to the background checks and disciplinary action, just as as other educators are. So it's a way to try to make sure that they're starting to prepare these teachers in a like manner as to when they finish their education, and that all of these individuals working with children are have had the background checks and are appropriate individuals to be working with our children to promote safety. Susan, you want to comment?
Right. So on one hand, this may be seen as a welcome provision by districts that are having difficulty finding, subs. Depending on how they feel in terms of having, a student in there as a sub. What is most interesting to me, though, is the provision, that talks about subjecting the permit holders to record check, wrap back, and then disciplinary action in the same manner as other educators. So, I mean, depending on what the final language is, the question I have is, does that mean, teachers are, by and large, union employees, and disciplinary procedures are addressed through a CBA. Subs generally are, especially in this context, I would not anticipate that these subs would be included in a bargaining unit. But does this mean, if they're subject to disciplinary action in the same manner as other educators, does this mean the just cause standard applies? Does this mean that if there's a progressive disciplinary provision in your CBA for your teaching union, do you have to progressively discipline these subs in the same manner? So I think there's a lot of open questions about what this impact may have in terms of the district's ability to manage the programming and manage the substitutes that they do bring in under the program.
About the disciplinary action, Susan. See, that's why we need people who work in this space along with people at the General Assembly. Next slide, please. So teacher licensure grade bands. Several years ago, I am sure all of you remember, we changed our traditional licensure grade bands from pre-K 8 and 612 to these smaller bands of pre-K 5, 4, 9, and 7, 12. And there has been some conversation with superintendents that they are having issues filling buildings, particularly challenges in buildings where the grade bands don't fit this smaller grade band mix. And so they have put this proposal in to go back to the pre-K 8 and 612 bands for licensure to provide flexibility. I do know that this is not been well received by some individuals, and that there will be an attempt to go back, change this back to current law, and then provide the districts with the ability to file for waivers. Whether that language will make it in or not, I don't know. I think that's fairly complicated, but certainly the General Assembly or the Republicans in the House in this particular instance are very cognizant that superintendents have requested additional flexibility in their teachers' licensures and who they can use where. Lisa.
Yeah, when we read actually the text as it was proposed by the House, the reintroduction of the pre-K to 8 and grade 6 to 12 grade bands will only apply, the way the House wrote this, to licenses issued on and after November 2nd, 2018. So while conceptually the proposal makes some sense under the philosophy as stated by the House in the declaration of their version of the bill, that they're responding to public schools and superintendents and administrators needing additional flexibility in responding to staffing needs, the fact that the way the House proposed the actual grade band specifications to apply to license issued on or after November 2nd, 2018, and not to license issued prior to that, creates really complex issues for school administration, particularly in the context of collective bargaining, issues such as seniority lists, reduction in force, transfer rights, things of that nature. I had a chance to talk with one of our panelists today about this a little bit earlier this week, and I know he'll want to chime in on this a little bit more when we get to the panel portion of our discussion. But I also would anticipate, as this version of the bill starts the hearing process in the Senate, we'll probably hear quite a bit from the OEA and some of their folks that might have strong feelings about these changes and kind of a tiered system, license issued on or after November 2nd, 2018, and then those issued prior. Also of note, the grade band proposal as set forth by the House does not apply to a host of different types of license. For example, IS, health, PE, music, career tech. Those are just to name a few. The House was very specific that the proposal did not apply to those particular license subject areas.
Okay, next slide, please. So the last couple of years, we have had a lot of conversation about dyslexia and dyslexia screening. I know that has the General Assembly said, look, we need to be looking at these children, determining whether these children have this particular learning challenge and then addressing it. And it hasn't been the smoothest rollout by the Department of Education. So again, we see language with regards to dyslexia in the budget bill. And this one is going to require professional development training by these following dates. Everybody teaching literacy, everybody in the K-1 space has to have their dyslexia training by the beginning of this next school year, so by August of 23. In the 2-3 space, they're going to have their training done by September 15th of 24, and in the 4-12 space by September 15th of 2025. For teachers hired after April 12th, 2021, they have 2 years after they are hired to prove that they've taken the training, to take the training or to prove that they have taken the training when employed by a different district. The bill does require ODE to identify a tier 1 screening measure by 1/1 of 24 and make that screening measure available for free to the districts. The governor would require that all districts use this training measure by the beginning of the 24-25 school year. The House took that language and made it permissive. So if a district is using a different screening measure, they would be able to continue to use that measure rather than the governor's proposed mandate of using the measure developed by ODE. Finally, the bill requires that students who transfer into a district mid-year be screened unless the student or there's proof that the student was screened at their original school. The district must do that screening within 30 days of the children's enrollment or a request by their parent or guardian for that screening to take place. Lisa.
Yeah, so I'm not going to touch on the tier 1 screening measure or the difference between the governor's requirement that districts use that screening measure versus the House proposal being permissive. But I do want to highlight just one piece on the professional development side of the ledger for dyslexia. So currently, by the start of this coming school year, 23-24, we know that our teachers licensed to teach K-1 have to have completed the dyslexia training requirements as set forth and promulgated by ODE. And then by the start of the following school year, 24-25, current law will require teachers licensed in teaching grades 2 and 3 to have completed that training. And then by the beginning of 25-26 school year, all intervention specialists teaching grades 4 through 12 will have to have completed the dyslexia training requirements. What the governor did in his version of the proposal is he created, as Sherri mentioned, kind of a strata between teachers hired after April 12th, 2021, and teachers hired prior to April 12th, 2021. They will now have, if this version of the budget, the version as proposed by the governor and as proposed by the House, goes in unchanged by the Senate, then we will have basically 2 tiers of teachers that have to complete these training requirements by different dates. And it's all going to be determined based on date of hire. And the magical date is April 12th, 2021. I don't really know why. We could probably back into that. But what it's going to require our districts to do, of course, is pull their seniority lists to determine when were their teachers actually hired, and then bifurcate them out based on the areas they're licensed to teach to the extent that they're required to have the dyslexia training, and then determine the required target dates for completion. So I'm sure some of our panelists will want to chime in on this when we get to the panel portion, but that magical date of the April 12th, 2021 is certainly interesting and is probably going to require additional legwork as we roll into the summer to ensure that our folks are trained, the ones that we thought needed to be trained, and maybe now we have some others that.
So next slide, please. With the dyslexia, we're going to roll into the 3rd grade reading guarantee. As you are all aware, if your 3rd graders do not pass the literacy examination that is offered multiple times a year right now, you are required to hold them back and have them repeat 3rd grade. The House version of the bill eliminates that 3rd grade reading guarantee starting in the 23-24 school year, and it eliminates one of the administrations of that test. Districts, even though the guarantee and holding the child back would be eliminated, districts will still be required to offer interventions and remediation services to students who are reading below grade level. And then the final thing the bill does in this space is prohibits holding a child back solely based on reading achievement scores in this current 2022-2023 school year. This is something that many individuals in the House feel very passionately about. They believe that the elimination of the reading guarantee is critical, that parents and school districts ought to be making this decision, not somebody at the state because the child doesn't test well on, a couple of given days. However, this is going to have to go through the Senate, and I will tell you that Senator Andy Brenner and the Senate is very passionate about the fact that we should not be promoting children who can't read at grade level by 3rd grade. So I do anticipate this probably coming out in the Senate or being significantly modified in the Senate, and then it will be a subject to conference committee. So there will be more to come on this one, Lisa.
Just a couple of quick notes, and I know for certain our panelists will want to weigh in on this in particular. Just a couple of quick notes. The governor in his version of the budget did not address 3rd grade reading guarantee at all. And so the House came in with a host of proposals, including, as Sherri stated, completely eliminating the retention provisions, and also requiring school districts that were intending to retain students for this coming school year, requiring that they not retain those students. So this is kind of that time of the year where districts are likely looking at those issues. This is, I think we're in the final week to 2 weeks or so of the administration of the 3rd grade reading guarantee testing. And so districts are probably in this window right now where they're trying to make these decisions for these 3rd grade students. Are we going to need to retain based on results of the 3rd grade reading guarantee this school year, or are we not? And so any districts that are currently in that spot, we're going to need to pay very close attention to this version of the House bill as it moves to the Senate to see what happens. Because if we're going to start sending letters home to parents, for example, in May, about possible retention based on results of 3rd grade reading guarantee, we're bumping up against a timing in which this bill may not have yet passed the Senate or have become law, but yet then we might have to be in a position of clawing back some of those decisions on retention based on current law. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves, and certainly appreciate that insight, Sherri. I had no perspective on what the Senate might do with this particular provision. So it's certainly interesting.
And something else that I think will make it very difficult for districts, and as you're planning for next year, you're not going to know how many third grade teachers you're going to need. I certainly think there are districts that would be faced with class sizes and assignments and that type of thing, which will be impacted potentially whether or not they have to hold these children back. So the General Assembly in this space is, while I think most people would say this is a good thing, not doing a lot of favors to all of you, given the way they're proposing the calendar on this, because we probably will not know for sure what's going to happen with this particular provision until July 1st, which will give you about 6 weeks before school starts to move all of these pieces around and these children amongst classes and teachers, which I'm presuming, and Susan, can you weigh in? You have to tell a teacher it would impact collective bargaining if they've got to move a teacher from one grade to another, correct? Because of class sizes.
Well, absolutely. So, many collective bargaining agreements address class sizes and, have ceiling numbers in terms of the maximum class size and that sort of thing. And then they, almost, I would say the majority of collective bargaining agreements have procedures related to involuntary transfers of teachers. So all of that would need to be looked at.
Next slide, please. Teacher residency program. So again, this is a provision, this is an area the governor did not touch, but the House has come in and made some pretty substantial changes to the current teacher residency program. It will require the department to provide no cost online access to resource and sample videos of Ohio classroom lessons. It allows those individuals who do not pass their RESA to have no cost access to meet with an instructional coach and to discuss improvement strategies and professional development. It will provide new teachers access to those coaches if they have not yet taken or submitted the RESA, if the district will pay for those costs. It will allow an individual an unlimited number of attempts to successfully pass or submit the RESA. It broadens the time frame within which an individual can submit the RESA so it broadens it from 1 October through, and then it also places timeframes on when results have to be returned from, it limits them to 30 days for the results unless a new assessor is requested, and then it's a 45-day turnaround, and then it turns around and reduces the time frame of these initial licenses from 4 years to 2 years. So it's going to compress how long individuals have to have completed this process. And this one is going to Susan.
Right. So this one, is, I think from my perspective, a bit of a moving target for districts because, many districts are still adjusting their policies and their collective bargaining agreements as it relates to the prior House Bill 4482 that made changes to the resident educator program and took it to a 2-year program, among other things. So while many districts have already updated their policies, right now is negotiation season. So I'm currently negotiating several contracts where one of the proposals on the table is changes to the resident educator to meet the standards of, the House Bill 4482. And now, we have this coming into play now as well. So, there may be obviously more changes down the pike. What's interesting to me is the elimination of a cap on the number of times that a participant, can successfully try to, complete the RESA requirements. Most collective bargaining agreements provide for some sort of payment to mentor teachers, whether that's through a stipend or sometimes through a supplemental. So, if you have, teacher in the resident educator program who is continuously able to keep trying to get the license, does that mean that mentor is working more? Is that mentor getting paid more for that? So I think that will be certainly an open question for districts. And then the other interesting part of this is that I think that, let's see, that might be on the second slide, but there is the option for mentoring to occur online. So districts are going to have to think about whether they want to allow that or not. I think it's noted in the fiscal analysis that online mentoring may occur from a teacher in another school district, right? And so then is the district now contracting with the other school district in terms of having to pay compensation to that mentor? If the district doesn't want to allow online or does want to allow online, does that have to be bargained with their union? And that is, dependent partially at least on the existing provisions of the resident educator provision that may be in your collective bargaining agreement. So there's going to be, a lot of moving parts to look out for on this, and a lot of adjustments that may need to be made depending on the final provisions.
And then if you go to the next slide, that'll have the rest of the components of the resident changes. And you can see where they have a fiscal analysis. Now, their fiscal analysis is relatively low, but I think one of the issues that will come into play is the presumption that a lot of districts are going to send some of this stuff to the Department of Education, and the Department of Education will be providing these services. And given that it will be free for individuals who have attempted once to successfully submit their RESA or pass their RESA, the district will then not have to pay for that additional coaching because the Department of Education will be paying for it. So we'll see how that plays out. Next slide, please. Professional development. So this is going to require the districts to provide 1 day of professional development leave every school year to allow teachers to observe a veteran teacher in a classroom. There are some issues with this, given that there's some definitions that are missing, I think, in this space, which will become a challenge. But certainly they are making a lot of attempts to facilitate positive mentoring or role modeling that teachers can emulate as they move teaching, as they develop in their career. Susan, you want to comment on this one?
Right, so this certainly would have a financial impact because, what this essentially creates is another bucket of leave, for teachers, right? So, and there's already, myriad categories of leave in most collective bargaining agreements and board policies. So then here's another bucket of leave. And so when you have a teacher that has an additional day of leave, then of course that means that there's a sub that, is going to need to be called. So then those are increased substitute costs. Or, some collective bargaining agreements talk in terms of class coverage. So maybe, in the state of the world right now, sometimes subs can't always be found. So then you may be paying other teachers for class coverage to cover the class while the teachers on the PD leave. So, that's obviously a concern. The question is too, and I don't know, Sherri, if is the veteran teacher, is that intended to be, I read that as being intended to be in another district, or is that intended to be within the same district? Has there been any discussion on that?
That's my knowledge. That's going to be a question that will have to be developed, or that's one of those questions that will have to be kind of teased out over time.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if it turns out that it's either authorized to be a veteran teacher in the same district, then there can be certainly an assertion that that veteran teacher that's being observed, should get some either compensation or some benefit for participating in that process. Or if they're going to another district, what will that look like? What is the structure of that? Lots of questions about that and how a district can manage the PD scheduling as well. So that the district, for instance, the district may want to look at saying, okay, you have this PD leave, but no more than X amount of teachers may take that leave on a given day because of class coverage considerations, or you cannot utilize leave on a day that would require class coverage by another teacher, that may implicate, additional compensation to that teacher or something along those lines. So there's going to be a lot of open questions about what sort of structure a district can put into place to try to avoid or at least minimize the financial impact to this, and also minimize the operational impact to this because of having teachers out of their classroom, more.
Okay, so next slide, please. Mental health continues to have a lot of conversation at the State House in a variety of areas. And one of those areas now will be training for coaches, athletic coaches. So the House version requires that a coach take a student mental health training course approved by the State Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And then it goes on and it makes some other changes to coaches' training, such as how frequently they must complete cardiac arrest training and brain trauma and brain injury management training. But clearly this is going to impact any coach that's involved or has a certificate or a permit to coach in the state of Ohio, and districts will have to make sure that their coaches are compliant with this new training. Susan? No, I'm sorry, Lisa.
This was Lisa's, yeah.
So interestingly, this appears to be kind of a regurgitation of House Bill 492 from the prior legislative session that didn't gain a lot of traction. It's not the first time the concept has been introduced. It just didn't go anywhere the last go around. The requirement as set forth in the House version of the budget would be that each time an individual applies for or renews a pupil activity program permit, they're going to have to complete this mental health training as part of that process. And interestingly, it also only applies to coaching and athletic activity as proposed by the House. It would not apply to the pupil activity permits that are required to supervise other types of extracurricular activities that are considered non-athletic. So that's kind of the current version there.
You oftentimes see this happen where legislators are unable to get a bill through or get any traction. You saw it with the third grade reading guarantee as well. That was a bill that was introduced in the last session and they didn't get it passed. And so they will tee it up for a budget amendment and put it into the state budget. It's one of the reasons our budgets typically are thousands and thousands of pages because of all the policy changes that people couldn't get through on standalone bills. Probably the most infamous provision that happened in that way was our original proficiency tests, which got slipped into a budget bill at the last minute without a whole lot of debate, because that bill never would have been able to advance to the General Assembly. So that's another one where this is another instance, not to the level of proficiency tests, but it is a common practice. Next, we're going to move to the autism intervention providers. And what this does, this is a House provision. So I need the next slide, please. Sorry. The House puts in language that allows registered behavior technicians and certified behavior analysts to provide services under the Autism Scholarship Program and expects them from having to obtain an instructional assistant permit. We do have some schools in the state that specifically cater to autistic children. These are two types of providers who work with these individuals, and they are licensed or registered with other licensing agencies or entities such as the State Psychology Board. And so this would exempt them from having to obtain those permits. If the permits they obtain under those licensing boards would be enough to work with these children in these scholarship programs. And this one is Lisa.
Just a couple of quick notes on that. So the governor did not have a proposal on this in his version of the budget, but the House came in under kind of the philosophical approach of saying, we want to increase the availability of providers for intervention services under the Autism Scholarship Program. And so they expanded the ability for RBTs and BCPAs to provide these intervention services under the scholarship provisions. Interestingly enough, the way the House worded their version of the bill, they specifically included the scope of in-home services to be provided by these RBTs and BCBAs under the Autism Scholarship Program. The funding is available even when they're providing in-home services. So that provision was specifically set forth in the House version of the budget.
Next slide, please. So one of the last topics we're going to do quite a bit with is transportation. Transportation has had a lot of conversation in the last 4 to 6 years. Much of it generated because, first of all, transporting children has become more complicated, particularly with the school bus driver shortage that we're seeing. But also it's become, obviously, I know you're all aware, much more complicated for districts as more and more districts are having to transport children to other types of educational environments, charter schools, STEM schools, chartered non-public schools. All of those responsibilities are falling on the districts. The individuals in the choice space maintain that their children are not transported appropriately. So in the last budget, they tried to put some language in and penalties for districts that fail to transport appropriately. And that hasn't worked real well. So there are several provisions in the budget that are going to address transportation. This is the first one. The House considered a proposal that will allow districts to use a vehicle designed to carry 9 passengers or less, not counting the driver, when transporting students to a chartered non-public school. Now, this does not mean that you can use a van to transport a basketball team, even if there's only 6 kids going, because this flexibility is only granted to carry passengers when they're transporting them to a chartered non-public school. Susan?
Right. So this bill certainly does have, potential labor implications in terms of, generally speaking, in most districts, your transportation employees are the ones that are transporting, whether it is by school bus or, by van, for things like transportation for students with special education needs, or midday routes that don't transport as many students as, your regular AM or PM routes. So, I mean, on first blush, this can provide more flexibility because it reduces the rescinds the requirement for a CDL, to be able to drive that van, and there could be potential less equipment costs if you can, if you can purchase a van and not a bus, for instance, to provide some of this transportation. But I think you're going to be looking at your union contracts and the transportation provisions to, make sure that, number one, if a district wants to use this to, for instance, have someone that's not a transportation employee pitch in as needed, that very well could be an issue with your bargaining unit in terms of using an administrator, for instance, for bargaining unit work. So that's going to have to certainly be looked at by a district, and if they want to be able to utilize this provision.
Next screen, please. So, as I said, transportation has been a hot button issue. The governor has proposed earmarking or allocating over $1 million out of transportation funds to go towards training and enrolling drivers in RAPAC. And then another provision that he has put in place is a provision which says that if a district is offering payment in lieu of providing transportation, then they must pay that person not less than 50% and not more than the average cost of pupil transportation for the previous year as determined by ODE. I think there's been some conversation about districts trying to offer parents a little bit more so they don't have to have the burden of transporting those students. So we've seen, and he's put that language in. And then next slide, please. But to try to address this in a different way, the House has proposed a pilot program, and this pilot program is going to establish the ability of up to five educational service centers to provide transportation to students enrolled in a community STEM or chartered non-public school instead of the school's home district. Now, again, timing on this is interesting because they have allocated the money. The ESCs have to have the program up and running in July of this year for school year 23-24, and then turn around and have to have a report back next summer to determine how well this program went. So given that this language won't even be finalized until July 1st, I find it a little funny that they think that these ESCs are going to be able to do this or anyone's going to be willing to participate. Although my guess is there's probably an ESC that is in this space that wants to participate and are working on this, thinking that they're going to get this language through the budget. So with that, Lisa, do you want to make some comments on transportation, these transportation provisions?
Not a ton, just I'm trying to pay attention to the time for our panelists. But I did want to just kind of chime in on the pilot program. So it appears to be a one-year pilot, as Sherri, you indicated, would be rolled out. 5 different ESCs would be selected throughout the state with one school district served by each of those ESCs also participating in the pilot. So the launch would be August 1. The eval would occur July 1 of 24. And the House version of the budget has earmarked $1 million for FY24 to support this pilot program. It's interesting, the House version indicates that ODE will be required to collaborate with the Ohio ESC Association Program Cabinet in order to select the 5 ESCs that will participate and a school district served by each of those ESCs. The school districts that are served by those ESCs are certainly going to have collective bargaining considerations to keep in mind, particularly as they're rerouting certain students. If they choose to participate in this pilot for 1 year, there's could be collective bargaining implications with the routing and planning and timing, et cetera.
So one other thing in the next slide, please. In the transportation space, just to be aware of, is that the House has put in language which requires that boards of education to provide each pupil in grades K through 8 substantially the same level of transportation services, regardless of what type of school they attend. And then they're also trying to limit, they've also limited the penalties. So I think some of you may be aware that there were some pretty draconian penalties being imposed out of the last budget on school districts that weren't complying with the provisions, the transportation requirements as they were written. They are limiting that penalty for non-compliance to the daily amount of the state transportation payment for the students who did not receive the required service instead of the daily amount of the district's total. So they are trying to limit that, but I think they will be more aggressive in trying to collect those or to impose those fees or penalties on districts that aren't compliant in this space. And then, at least I'll get back to you one second. I'm just going to throw in one last one real quick. There is a program or a provision in the budget that's going to require ODE to reimburse districts, making school breakfasts and lunches free for all students who are eligible for the reduced lunch program if the district participates in the National School Breakfast or Lunch Program. I anticipate, and that's the last slide if somebody wants to forward it, I anticipate that provision disappearing. I happen to know that provision went in the House. And I do not believe there's support in the Senate to completely undertake that cost, although it is a minor cost. It's only about $4 million a year. So with that, I'm going to throw that to Lisa and Susan for the panel discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sherri. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, great. So as Sherri mentioned, we're moving into our panel discussion at this point. I know we covered a lot of ground in the first part of this webinar. And just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please feel free to add those to the Q&A. It looks like we have a couple in there now, but you are certainly still welcome to add any questions that you might have as we continue in the panel discussion. And again, we'll address those at the end. So first, let's start with a little bit of background on each of our panelists. First, we have panelist Brian Kuhn, who is the superintendent of Clark-Shawnee Local School District. Brian has 20 years of experience in education with 14 years in school administration. He's currently in his 5th year as superintendent at Clark-Shawnee, starting August 1 in 2018. He served as assistant superintendent of Clark-Shawnee for 6 years from 2012 to 2018. Prior to that, he has 3 years experience as a building principal, serving at both Possum Elementary in Clark-Shawnee and Houston Elementary in the Greenon School District. Before moving into administration, Mr. Kuhn taught for 6 years between his time at Indian Valley Middle School and Starbase at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Mr. Kuhn has led the district through building construction projects, merging 3 elementary schools, the passage of operating levies, and navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. He currently sits on the MVECA Board of Directors and the Clark County Job and Job Readiness Task Force. Mr. Kuhn is a superintendent of the Buckeye Association of School Administrators and serves on the State Department Committee. During the summer of 2023, Mr. Kuhn will join Wittenberg University as an adjunct professor teaching a graduate course in school law. In addition to his work in education, Mr. Kuhn served 6 years on the Board of Elders at Maiden Lane Church of God. He is a member of the Springfield Rotary Club, and he is a graduate of the Leadership Clark County Academy. Mr. Kuhn holds a bachelor's degree in middle childhood education from Wittenberg University and a master's degree in educational leadership from the University of Dayton. Mr. Kuhn and his wife, Erin, reside in the Clark-Shawnee district with their 5 children, James, Jacob, Madeline, Samantha, and Riley. In his spare time, he enjoys spending time with his family and reading. Next slide, please. Okay, our next panelist is Dr. Eugene T.W. Sanders. He is the Executive Director of the Ohio Mid-Sized School Districts Leadership Collaborative, Inc., which is a partnership of 24 school superintendents in Ohio focusing on 3 key priorities: raising academic achievement through implementing instructional rounds, leadership and executive training, and policy development through legislative reform that supports students and families. He is also the CEO and president of the Sanders Transformation Group, LLC, a consulting firm focusing on strategic leadership alignment for school organizations and corporate settings with offices in Sandusky, Ohio, and Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. He served as Chief Executive Officer for the Toledo, Cleveland, and Sandusky schools, and is a former professor and department chair for the doctoral program in leadership studies at Bowling Green State University. He is married to Paulette, and they have 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. Next slide. Okay, and last but certainly not least, we have Ken R. Zeman. Ken is the CFO and treasurer of Lakewood City School District and has held that position since December 1, 2013. Prior to assuming that position, Mr. Zeman was treasurer of the Board of Education of the Avon Local School District for 9 years, treasurer for the Board of Education for the Olmsted Falls City School District for 3 years, and treasurer for the Clearview Local School District for 3.5 years. Ken's professional memberships include the American Society of Certified Public Accountants, the Ohio Society of Certified Public Accountants, and the Ohio Association of School Business Officials. Okay, so now that we all know a little bit about our panelists, I am going to flip this to Lisa to get the panel discussion started. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Great. Good morning, panelists, and thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. So I want to start just if each of you, and we'll start with Mr. Kuhn and then go to Dr. Sanders and then to Mr. Zeman. Tell us a little bit about your district, your role there, and although we've covered a lot of territory this morning, what from your perspective is the most important or beneficial component of this state budget bill as we've discussed this morning? So we'll start with you, Mr. Kuhn.
Thank you, Lisa. Our district, we're a small rural district of about 1,650 students. We've been keeping a close eye on all these different provisions. So the one that stands out the most, the one that we've been looking at, is the fair school funding formula and some of the implications for that. And I think the biggest thing that we're seeing is the transition from FY18 inputs to FY22 inputs. Because if the fair school funding model is the formula used to adequately fund schools in Ohio, we have to make sure the inputs are appropriate and accurate in order to get the accurate output. So I think that's going to be a big component for us, something we've been advocating for, and something we're going to continue to advocate for as the budget bill moves through.
Excellent. Dr. Sanders?
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning to all of the panelists. I'm proud to be on today with my colleagues, Brian and Kent. And I guess I would offer three sort of broader strategic observations regarding the budget conversation for this period. One is the importance of restrictive versus local decision-making within the policies that are created. I've always been an advocate over my 42-year career. I'm a 3-time superintendent in Cleveland, Toledo, and the last 10 years in Sandusky. So I've had a CEO experience for the last 22 years. And over the course of all three of those districts, ranging from 75,000 students in Cleveland back in 2006 to 3,500 kids in my hometown of Sandusky, Ohio, the ability to have local decision-making within the sphere of what's a priority for us, I think is an important element within the budget decision-making. So many of the policies, as my colleague Brian sort of indicated, tend to stem around more restrictive guidelines, things you can do, things you cannot do. And I've always been an advocate of having fiscal decisions that allow the local districts to make decisions in their best interest. The second sort of umbrella or bucket of discussion for me today centers around curriculum and local decision making around curriculum that have, in the past decade or so, in my view, have had more political kinds of implications than we have in previous years. There was a time in the early part of my career where the clarity of the political role was less dynamic at the local and state level, and that certainly seems to have increased over the last several years. And then finally, I would argue that there is a need for all of our budget and fiscal decisions to have the integration of economic development and local job-related creative opportunities, along with the importance of inclusion and diversity, which in my view is always a strength of Ohio, us working together, working collaboratively in order to elevate the collective work of the state itself. So I would offer a conversation around restrictive and less restrictive rules around fiscal decision-making, the importance of in local decision-making around curriculum as relates to both books and teachers, and also then finally the integration of economic and job creation opportunities within the concept of inclusion and diversity of all individuals in the state of Ohio.
That's great perspective, big picture. Sometimes we get so focused on the granular things that are being proposed that we lose sight of the bigger vision.
Sure.
Thank you for that. Mr. Zeman.
Sure, Kent Zeman. Lakewood City Schools is an inner ring suburb of Cleveland, so I'm definitely familiar with Dr. Sanders and his time at Cleveland, as well as his time at Sandusky. And then again, as a treasurer, I always love to hear superintendents talk about the first thing is funding. So awesome, well done. But yeah, without a doubt, the Fair School Funding Plan and their mission and what they've done, that work group over the last 5 years, and to make sure we keep pushing that forward, to have those inputs continually increase to keep up with, especially in these inflationary times, is critically important. And again, building off what Dr. Sanders said in regards to those restrictions, Lakewood's a guarantee district. So anytime that those dollars are restricted further, it actually reduces our local control of what we can do with those dollars, whether it's DPIA, the student wellness funds, and all those different inputs that go in that are further getting restricted. So that is a challenge. definitely appreciate all that the governor and the House have done, and we're looking forward to the Senate continuing that as well. Another unique thing with Lakewood is we are a career-centered collaborative with 3 other school districts. So what was really important in there, and Dr. Sanders talked about a little as well, is that workforce development dollars that the governor talked about, as well as dollars in there for the expansion of career tech, whether it be programming or the actual facilities to do that. So those are the couple things that I think positively come out of it, with, again, that conversation about the restrictions. And then lastly, the expansion of vouchers. While definitely appreciate how the legislature took it out of that deduction process and are funding it separately, there is only so much money that the state has, and a concern that as they expand the voucher program, potentially will that dwindle the amount of money overall for education, that then could potentially lead to those inputs maybe not being able to be increased because of that overall pot of money only being so much.
Fantastic perspective. Love the financial voice in the room. Mr. Kuhn, Dr. Sanders, anything in response to what Mr. Zeman had to say on that, or should we move on maybe to the next topic?
Yeah, I would only add very quickly, one, Kent's excellent assessment of the fiscal, the limited fiscal funds that are available, and the capacity of the local district to use those funds based on the priorities that they have at the local level. I can't leave a conversation at this level without being strongly vocal about charters and about vouchers. While I have a strong appreciation for the need for parents' rights and for students to have multiple options, I just want to be an advocate for having those options within the public school context. We started a option school in Toledo over 20 years ago, where we had high school options for students within the public school setting. So the dollars, not just the dollars, but really the strong curriculum with qualified faculty and teachers is often part of the conversation is not included. It's more of a, we want a choice. And then sometimes there's a serious question of the accountability, which I know we'll get into that conversation this morning as well. In my view, the significant lack of accountability for many of the options and choices and vouchers that are there. And candidly, it might even appear that there's two tracks as it relates to accountability, both for academic outcomes and for fiscal responsibility and accountability. I can't tell you, during my time as superintendent in Toledo, and even in Cleveland, a little less in Sandusky, the times my office would get calls about a school that the Sandusky School District or Cleveland District had no authority over. They were not part of our system. They were not connected to our fiscal accountability. They were totally run by other organizations, of which the parent had no clue that those organizations existed in terms of the responsibility for some of those schools. So I would only add to Kent's excellent assessment and summary that there is a strong need for funding to be wrapped around the public context, allow the local superintendents, the treasurers to have those options within the district context that allows for those parents to have those choices. And then there's a whole conversation, obviously, around both accountability for fiscal matters and accountability for academic outcomes, which it's clear that in many cases there have been no testing allowed in certain environments. When testing has been done, sometimes those scores are not available. They're not made public. There's a lack of accountability as it relates to who's on these boards and what their level of accountability is. And I just argue from a state perspective, we all need to be on the same playing field with transparency and accountability. I think that makes us stronger. And I think it ultimately leads to better outcomes, both academically and fiscal responsibility. Sorry for the long time, sorry.
That's perfect. Mr. Kuhn, I know we had talked a little bit about the transparency factor, and that's important to you. We had touched on that as well.
Yep, Dr. Sanders, you hit the nail on the head. If the state legislature is going to argue that parents' choice is important, then they owe it to the parents to make sure they're making informed choices. So are they able to compare data sets of student achievement and fiscal responsibility? The question remains, do community schools deliver better results at a lower cost? And I don't know if the data sets are there right now, or at least made public for parents to make an informed choice. So the legislators have to understand, if you're going to say this is an important foundational piece of education in Ohio, parents have then the right to make an informed decision, and it's just not there.
So I'm going to chime in real quick on this. There was a provision put in the House version of the budget, which will require a study be completed to try to provide apples to apples comparisons. What I will say is that the Senate President has indicated that he intends to remove that study. He doesn't believe it's necessary. And he has also already indicated that they believe that charters are facing an unfair burden right now, and that they will have additional accountability reform so that they can not have some of the burdens of regulations that they currently deal with as they get state funding. So while I know that all of you feel very firmly that we need to increase the accountability measures, I will tell you that's not an opinion shared currently by the state Senate. And so it will be fascinating to watch as we move through the process, who kind of comes out with what in the final version of the budget.
Sherri, you and Susan will probably remember a summary assessment done by the Akron newspaper some years ago. The local Akron paper, which was had a hotbed of charter related management groups there, and they did a study a couple of years back. And I think my colleagues Brian and Kent will not be surprised by the outcome, or at least the summary notes from their report. Now, the objectivity and the reliability and validity of the study, I am not familiar with that element of it. But I would think, though, that if we're continuing to put funds, significant funds, in areas where there isn't clear and consistent accountability, is just contrary to democracy. It's contrary to the standards that we all believe in as citizens. And I think the challenge for us in public school is to make our programs and offerings attractive, and to offer incentives, and to be competitive, and to show quantifiable results, that our work is better, that the results of our children are indeed better. But I did a study real quick when I was a professor at Bowling Green in the late 90s in Toledo, and I was curious why parents consistently chose charter schools that were consistently failing and were consistently receiving F marks, when the local public elementary school around the corner was substantially better qualified staff, better academic results. And unfortunately, it came down to some of the amenities that the schools were offering that were more appealing to the consumer than some of the other variables that we would see as appropriate measurable objectives, like student performance, classes offered, the qualifications of faculty and staff, which we would all assume are those variables that are high assessment tools. It was more of early daycare, after school care, the kind of food that they had at lunchtime, the friendliness of teachers, and really one of the big ones was accessibility to teachers by cell phone after hours, where there's this ongoing communication, Sherri, between the teacher and the kid at 4:30, 5:30, 6 p.m. at night, where you get answers to your homework and the like. Those variables were outweighing some of the more quantifiable variables that most of us as educators and policymakers would deem as high priority areas.
That's super compelling.
Just to tag on to what Dr. Sanders said, I've heard the argument before. I understand the argument about school choice, for families and parents, but I've also heard the argument before that, the voucher program, increases competition and therefore drives excellence, in the public school districts. But to your point, Dr. Sanders, I mean, if it's not a level playing field in terms of accountability, in terms of the hoops that, you have to jump through, then, I think that's an entirely false premise in terms of that being a beneficial byproduct of the voucher system. Sorry, Lisa,
Okay.
I interrupted you.
No, I was just gonna maybe transition us. We were gonna talk about what components of the budget provide the greatest concern to each of our panelists, but I feel like maybe we've touched on that. I'll offer it up just in case we haven't, but I want to also make sure we get to our discussion on greatest impact, positive and negative. Do we want to address any greater concerns than what we already talked about? Mr. Kuhn? Any concerns we haven't already talked about?
So one of the pieces that the team touched on earlier was that PD leave, right? That 1 day of professional leave, and when it sounds like great a piece of this bill, assuming that we don't already do that as a district as a best practice. We do that especially for teachers newer to the profession. That's kind of what we do. So when you start to pull at the string at this, we talked about it being an additional pool of leave days. Is this a requirement that this shall happen, or is it we just provide it? What if a teacher of mine in Clark-County says, hey, I have a friend who teaches, a colleague I went to school with, teaches up at Put-in-Bay and does great things in the classroom. I want to do my day up there. Well, what are the expenses, the time? Like, where does this impact collective bargaining, right? And then just from a cost alone, my treasurer is on as a participant. He's texting me. He's done the math. 125 teachers times our sub rate. This is going to cost us $13,000 a year potentially, and that wouldn't include. That's just sub cost. So you start to pull at these things, and again, you've got folks at the legislature who aren't with us, living the day in, day out, don't understand what we do as best practices, routine practices, local decisions, and here we are. It looks good, but is it more complex than it appears on its face?
And I'll jump in.
It totally ignores the fact that there's already, most districts already have a pretty robust professional development structure in place, right? Whether that's sometime, a day or more in the start of the school year at convocation and that sort of thing, and then sprinkled out throughout, so I mean, it's already in place. So that the question of the necessity of this, especially when it appears that it can be more teacher driven in terms of what they do and what the subject is that they address, is concerning. Ken, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, that's quite all right. And again, here in Lakewood, I can tell you that, again, professional development is always something we push for and strive for. However, there is limitations. We've had to actually limit some of our grade level. We have neighborhood elementary, so grade levels need to get together. We've had to limit that due to the substitute teacher shortage and trying to figure out best ways to provide professional development without impacting the instructional delivery. So what we've also done is working with our unions is taken away instructional days for professional development. So, you start the year off with 184 teacher days, and it dwindles down to 178 instruction days right away. And then we've chipping away at that a little bit in order to provide that professional development to improve the instructional delivery, but, at what cost? And again, even on, take the fiscal cost out of it, it's that day, that time in front of a child with their teacher is most critical. You can put a substitute in a classroom for a day, and you might be the world's greatest substitute teacher, but that delivery, that instructional day will not be the same as having their teacher in front of them. So that's something that, again, is a concern. And I'm glad Brian brought that up as well.
If I could add something very quickly, I don't want us to gloss over Sherri's comment a couple of minutes back about the perspective that the majority of the legislators have about some of these issues around restrictive versus more flexibility within the budgets, and the perspective around choice and options and the business model, choice and opportunity sort of raising all standards. I think we should acknowledge a couple of things. One, that we I want to argue that we should stay engaged with our local elected, our state officials around these conversations and expose them to the work that's happening at the local level so that they have a perspective, a real-time perspective about the quality of work that's taking place in the districts. And because we are up against, in my view, perspectives that are opposite from the three panelists. The three panelists, my colleagues, we all have a common denominator around the role of public education in a 21st century kind of environment. That may not be the same perspective that a majority of the legislators have about how they view public schools and the role that public schools play in education in today's environment. So I want to just express public appreciation to Roetzel and our colleagues there who do such an amazing job of making sure we're up to speed, we're kept abreast, and that we should consistently engage with our legislators about those matters that are of the highest priority. And I think arguing the value of public education in 2023 is still a valid set of discussions that need to take place both at the state house level and at the local level. Even though we're climbing uphill a bit on some of these perspectives, I think I know I would not be where I am today had it not been for teachers and coaches and mentors and advisors and public school people who went above and beyond the call of duty, right? And then we spend our lives as educators trying to replicate that set of engagement with the students that we are exposed to in our careers. So there are some uphill battles around philosophy and perspectives and opinions, where people get their data from and things of that nature. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to be strong advocates for one of the last institutions in our nation that provides an equal opportunity for all students and families. And I just think that's important not to gloss over, that there are some challenges there, but it doesn't mean that we should surrender our perspectives about the value and the opportunities that public schools provide.
Excellently said. Anyone else want to weigh in on the professional leave requirement as per the House version, or other concerns we want to address before we move on to our next set of questions? Any other concerns, like kind of general overarching concerns with the budget as proposed, or do we want to go on to the greatest impact, positive and negative statements?
I'll just throw one more in. Again, this won't take long. It's on the, again, the Fair School Funding Plan Work Group and the state has moved forward. There's still a number of school districts that will remain, on the guarantee, which tells you anytime you put whether it's a transitional aid, a guaranteed aid, that's a Band-Aid, right? So I appreciate the fact that we continue to work forward to get those districts off. One of the unintended consequences for those districts that will remain on the guarantee is something they should keep an eye on, is that special education set aside. So a 10% reduction happens to all school districts, whether or not they receive that money back or not. The increase of that inputs will actually increase that set aside for districts. So that amount will be a higher amount. So even a district like Lakewood, who is a guarantee, our quote unquote guarantee will go down slightly because of that set aside, because that's outside of the guarantee amount. So just something for people to take note of.
Significant for sure.
Nothing's perfect, so I understand things like that happen.
Significant for sure. Anybody else before we go on to greatest impact, positive or negative? All right, Mr. Kuhn, let's start with you. As we review the budget this morning, what do you view as having the most or greatest impact on your district, positive or negative? I know your staff kind of feels strongly about the third grade reading guarantee provision. Did you want to address that?
Yeah, so my teachers at the elementary school, again, a smaller school, they're both within walking distance, so I'm in buildings quite a bit. The question is, where is this landing? What's going to happen? And I shared with them, hey, look at this budget bill iteration says starting next year, that retention's gone. And then there's also that last paragraph about it being eliminated for this year if the retention is solely based on the test assessment. And they strongly feel that this legislation is important because this year's third graders were kindergartners during the 1920 school year. So when school shut down in the spring in March for them, they were in kindergarten. And then the next year where we came back, whether it was hybrid, remote, full on, like we did the best, districts did the best they could with the information that they had at the time. That was a formative year of instruction for them. So we are closing the gap. We have data to show that we are moving the needle back to pre-pandemic levels. We need more time. Our teachers are working hard to get there, but to punish, it is perceived as a punishment to enforce that on these students, given all they've been through since becoming public school students as kindergartners. It seems heavy. And we can close gaps. We can do the work. Schools can do that. Again, as Dr. Sanders said, local decisions, local efforts. When you make universal requirements, it's not a one size fits all. And so by giving schools the opportunity to put those interventions in place at the local level and get that work done to close gaps for students is important. So my teachers are very passionate that this retention piece needs to go away. Plus, the high stakes testing for a third grader. I mean, we've got kids freaking out over testing it. We just had a tragedy in our district. We had in our county, we had 2 high school students killed in a car accident. One of them has a sibling that is an elementary school student who has anxiety about school and wants to do well. The day after the passing, the student's parents are reaching out to our mental health therapist because the student's worried about state testing. And like, that's not okay. So I told the mental health therapist to tell the family, Mr. Kuhn, we will figure it all out. I will take a non-tested student on the report card because at that moment in time, that's not what matters. Like, but that's what I have a student worried about in elementary school the day after their sister passes. Like, that's not okay. So the high stakes anxiety for a third grader, it just doesn't feel right.
Well, and to your point, Brian, I mean, these are students that by and large were not in school in front of a teacher in a classroom, let alone the other factors that go into high stakes state testing. It's just very convoluted. Great perspective though. So our other panelists, Dr. Sanders, Mr. Zeman, want to weigh in on that issue or other areas of greatest impact to your district or organization, positive or negative, as proposed in the budget?
Sure, I'll offer a couple of perspectives that would be unique to our Ohio mid-sized schools, which include schools that are in close proximity to larger urban communities. So they share, in many cases, like a Lakewood, for example, they share a lot of common denominators with the Cleveland district in terms of families and infrastructure and other sets of dynamics. I would just reiterate the importance of the fair funding formula and the importance of having those resources to apply to the areas where you think are important to the local district. And it seems like, as it relates to testing, at least, that when legislators become personally aware of the impact of a particular measure, there seems to be a stronger sort of reaction to that. And sometimes we get better results, if you will, when there's a personalized impact that the legislator feels or is aware of, or if their own child or grandchild is exposed to that particular measure, then it sort of elevates that conversation to a higher level. Again, another reason for advocacy and for exposure and engagement with state legislators about the practical impact of policies that are discussed at a state and higher macro level versus what really happens at the individual level. So I would add a couple of observations. One, the fair funding, the ongoing need for practical exposure of legislators to local issues. And then I'd add another piece. That was a piece that Sherri and the team referenced earlier about safety and security. And if there is an issue that has resonated with the public, in recent times, has been the level of safety that a child experiences in their particular school, and how we, as educational leaders, can position our students and faculty for the best, safest environment that we possibly can. And so I do appreciate any measure in a budgetary conversation around safety and security as it relates to having sufficient staff, having sufficient training. And there's been some viral videos lately that have been around that have highlighted student behavior dynamics as it relates to the teacher-student interaction, which to me speaks to social emotional support dynamics within the school itself. And so in addition to hiring another security guard, I think that we have to think about how do we invest in changing people's perspectives and attitudes about how they interact with others, what's appropriate social engagement, how do you effectively communicate, how do you de-escalate issues and concerns in a way that ends in a result that's not confrontational or some type of physical result. And of course, when those things happen in the public school setting and they come out in the media, it is a negative reflection on our schools in a way that resonates with people that I don't think is in our best interest as it relates to policy and decision making and image and perspective. So I think safety, the safety and security measures, I'm always in favor of legislative options that provide more support for those measures. But I would also argue that an investment into the social emotional dynamics of both children and faculty and staff. Did a seminar in, I'm retired now, but I did a seminar in the district here over the last, and even though I'm retired, Ken, I'm doing like more work than I did before, right? But I did the seminar and I asked the faculty, what are their takeaways from the COVID experience and what would we do differently and things of that nature. And there are ranges of 3, 4, 5 numbers that faculty feel, this is in a smaller district like Sandusky, that faculty feel that the kids are going to need time to get over, to deal with. And so I even though we don't talk about COVID matters as much as we did before, I think not forgetting about the impact of COVID, not just what year we select to collect certain data, what years do we use that are maybe not always in our best interest around a particular outcome or how a cutoff score is determined, that the need to focus on the individuals and the experiences that they've had and how we can serve them better that ends up with better decision making by all parties, I think is worthy of our investment. I know that's an investment that pays out over time, but if we don't look at some of those variables, we're impacting our economy, we're impacting our economic development opportunities, and ultimately we're impacting the citizens in our state, which can have a negative impact on what it is we're trying to do statewide.
Very true.
Very well said, Dr. Sanders. And again, I think it's, we could talk about that issue alone for an hour.
Right.
So, appreciative of that comment. And I'd love to talk more about that too. I think I'll just throw in some things just to shift gear, even though what you said is so true. And I guess I'll piggyback on Lakewood City Schools receive, some safety and security grants through the governor's allocation. We received $100,000 per building to secure the buildings or to make them safer. But again, when the original success and wellness funds were out there, they were outside of that funding source. They were ways to do things that weren't inside of it. So again, if we could have those dollars in those ways to provide that more social, emotional, those type of things would be even better. So I think that's important is, we can secure the buildings, we can make them look more like prisons, I guess, but that's not going to solve the problem long term. So I needed to add that in as well. So I appreciate that. I would just offer the only other thing of concern is, again, that the replacement levy legislation. Again, as we move forward and try, they've already reduced the amount of times the school district can go to the ballot, right? It's May and November now. So it's already a challenge, and to take away another tool, another opportunity for the school district to raise additional funds without having to necessarily go and ask as if it was brand new. It's like, hey, this is a levy you've already been paying. We do need more. I was in a district prior to Lakewood where we had 7 emergency levies, so every year you were renewing or putting a new one on, and it just got, it was, it's called, levy, they were just tired. Our community was tired. So we combined some. We did a replacement on one. We did substitutes on others when that opportunity came along. But those are all tools that we need to be able to raise those funds locally, which again, we need to have that partnership on the state. There's a local component and a state component. So that is a concern. If that's one that continues on, then what's the next one that will they continue?
We just passed a substitute continuing levy doing that same thing, combining, and we were able to do it for a continuing period of time. Thankfully, because given this legislation, as was mentioned before by the Roetzel team, we don't know what this means if it had to be renewed. But it's that idea that, hey, as development happens, because it's happening in our area, we are going to see an increase based on that new construction. So existing residents, you pay the same taxes, but those that are houses that come online, pay their fair share. But that all being said, and probably a topic for another session, is what superintendents and treasurers can and can't do moving down the road with levies anyway. So we'll save that for another time, right, Lisa?
Now there's a conversation right there.
Yeah.
Hello. Yep.
Well, yes, we
Talk
are
about a moving
anxiously
target.
awaiting. Yeah, we're anxiously awaiting that official rollout from the auditor state on the do's and don'ts, and great topic for another webinar for sure.
Right.
I think too, another big impact, and the Roetzel team did a good job kind of hitting it, is that licensure change. It seems benign when we talk about those license band changing, but it's not from a collective bargaining and a management standpoint. For example, it has implications for 3rd grade reading guarantee. As we talked, if we have to increase a 3rd grade teacher, right now, with the way the licensure bands are right now, maybe this is a reason to change it, but it just gets complex. A veteran 1 through 8 teacher teaching 4th grade might be involuntarily transferred over a 3rd year teacher who's got the 4.9 licensure teaching 4th grade. So I've had to do that in my time in a small district, is involuntarily transfer a veteran because of those licensure bands. The same type of thing becomes true when we get into, what was the other part? I have to get my note, but the licensure band piece. Oh, if we move to this new licensure band, and I have my last hire in the district is a 6th grade math teacher, and their license, the 6 through 12, that larger license. But I need to go down in the high school 1 teacher because with College Credit Plus and some of these things, I don't have as many courses. The last one, I apply our RIF procedures, that 6th grade person goes. But my 7th through 12th grade licensed folks, they can't teach 6th grade. So do I have to go at it again? And does that person that was originally RIF come back? Like, it gets very weird very quickly. So that one's going to have, it may seem benign and on the surface, but when we start to unpack it and apply it to collective bargaining and assignments, and it can get weird.
Unintended consequences for sure. Might be a good way of saying it. So if I'm monitoring the time correctly, we have about 60 seconds left in our session together. And we did have a question in the question box. Doesn't a renewal levy currently only bring in the original amount anyway with no increase? And we can probably respond to that offline just because we're out of time. But would anyone want to make concluding remarks, knowing that we are officially at our 12 noon stop time?
I'll defer to my colleagues.
I was going to defer to you, Mr. Eloquent and Dr. Sanders.
I would just encourage board members, treasurers, superintendents, school advocates in the room. We can't give up on the advocacy piece. Our board our treasurer, myself, we have probably advocated more than this year than we have in recent years, just given all the different things. So we have to continue the advocacy with our elected leaders representing our districts in the State House. We can't give up on that. It means something. It makes a difference. So work with OASBO, OSBA, BASA. That is important. The advocacy cannot be underestimated.
And as the last note, I would caution everybody to remember this is a work in progress. It is going to change. Some of it will probably change for the better. I would also bet that some of it's going to change for the worse. So please come back in about 30 days when we have the Senate version, and we will go back through. If you have questions, please reach out to one of us. We are more than willing to try to engage and help you in this space. But more to come. So watch as we move this budget through the process.
Right, absolutely. So as I said earlier, keep an eye on your emails for the part 2 and part 3 webinars that are coming up. If there are any suggested topics that maybe we didn't hit today, or that you wanted us to do a deeper dive in parts 2 or 3, please feel free to reach out to any of us as well to suggest that. And, just thank you all for hanging in there with us today. We covered a lot of complex topics, so we appreciate your participation, and we hope you all have a great day and a great rest of your week.
Thanks for having us, guys. We appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.
Yes, and thank you to our esteemed panelists. I think your contributions were wonderful and really brought home the real life impact and kind of the element of humanity that is involved in these bills that gets missed a lot when you're looking at it in more of a vacuum. So thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.